Welcome to Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists series. I'm Frances Littman, your host, and I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. Today's program will be extremely insightful. I'd like to introduce Jon O'Riordan, who will be introducing our esteemed guest today. Jon is our community partner. Jon, who keeps the legacy of his late wife, Gail O'Riordan, alive and is just magical. Gail was a beloved music teacher and professional cellist. This Climate and Artist webinar series continues each Wednesday from 11 a.m. till noon until the end of November. Thanks to Gail and Jon. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Frances. It's a great pleasure that I introduce Mace Rosenstein and Bob Sandford today. Mace has been advising media and communications companies on complex strategic, policy, legal, and regulatory matters for nearly 30 years. He has deep experience structuring and securing regulatory approvals for broadcast and telecommunications transactions. He is also a leader in the field of federal law and policy regarding foreign investments in the US media companies and on the Federal Communications Commission's complex rules governing multiple and cross ownership of media and telecommunications properties. Bob Sandford holds the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health. In this capacity, Bob is the co-author of the UN Water in the World report on post-2015 global sustainable development goals related to water. He is also the lead author of Canada in the Global World, a new United Nations expert report examining the capacity of Canada's water sector to meet and help others meet the United Nations 2030 Transforming Our World Water-Related Sustainable Development Goals. Both Bob and Mace now live in Canmore, Alberta, so they've become good friends. Thank you again, Mace, for preparing for this and look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Well, it's a great honor to have you here, Mace, and extremely timely, given how important the upcoming US election will be, not just for Americans, but to Canadians also, and to the rest of the world. Welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And you're right, Bob. This is a critical election, and I think we can say it's one of the most important in the history of the United States.
Well, you and I have been talking about how important this election is for some time, and we've discussed at length what is presently happening with respect to both domestic and foreign policy in the United States. And we've discussed how this goes back to 1989. And here's what some of us were saying then. Yes, the US pushed the Soviet system until it failed and put the weaknesses of the communist system into bold relief. And there was much rejoicing and self-congratulation. And some went so far as to declare the end of history. But it wasn't the end of history as we now know. And many of us were waiting at that time for the other shoe to drop, for the weaknesses in the now unconstrained American system to become equally obvious, and the potential for the collapse of the US system to become obvious also. And now the other shoe has finally and undeniably dropped. History has returned big time, and the weaknesses in the American system now stand out in bold relief. And it's now clear that the American system could collapse just as the Soviet system did, but for different reasons. The danger globally is that there is now not another American democracy strong enough to hold the world order together as there was when the Soviet Union collapsed. And many view Trump as a threat to the increasingly urgent global project of sustaining human presence on Earth. But you argue that this goes far deeper than Trump, and the potential for the collapse of the US is rooted in the country's founding constitution, and in particular in one institution, the Electoral College. And can you give us uncomprehending Canadians a short course in how the electoral process in the United States works and how the Electoral College fits into that system?
I will try. First, Bob, you have to get your mind around this. Under the US Constitution, when Americans go to the polls to elect the president, as they will soon, they're not actually voting directly for the candidate of their choice. Instead, they're voting for a group of state officials called electors who make up the Electoral College. Weeks after the November 3rd election, these electors will cast the votes that actually determine who has been deemed to have won the election. And my language, who has been deemed to have won, is significant here, and we'll come back shortly to why that is so. First, some mechanics. There are 538 electors in total. Each represents one electoral vote, and a candidate needs a majority of electoral votes, 270 or more, in order to win the presidency. Electoral votes in turn are allocated to each state based on the total number of senators and representatives in its US congressional delegation. You can see on the map that ranges from a minimum of 3 in sparsely populated states to a maximum of 55 in California.
This seems really complicated. Can you explain this to Canadians who are used to a system built on the British parliamentary model?
Again, we'll try, bear with me. Choosing electors for the Electoral College is a two-part process. So first, before the election, each political party in each state chooses a slate of potential electors corresponding to that state's number of electoral votes. Electors typically are state elected officials, state party leaders, major donors, and the like.
So do you mean to say that it's not just the voters, but also party members and political donors who influence who becomes president?
Oh, absolutely. If anything, I would argue that voters have the least power in this structure. And here's why. All but 2 states award their electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis based on the outcome of the popular vote in that particular state. That means that a winning candidate would be awarded, say, all of Texas's 38 electoral votes or California's 55, even if the margin of victory is as little as 50.1% to 49.9%. And this is what I was getting at a minute ago. If you're in that 49.9% in Texas or California or nearly every other state, your vote just doesn't count.
So this doesn't always happen, is that correct?
Well, it doesn't have to. For example, Maine and Nebraska split their electoral votes roughly according to the proportion of votes each candidate receives in that state. But the problem arises because states have near absolute power to control their own voting procedures, even in federal elections.
So what you're telling me and all the rest of us mystified Canadians is that in the United States, because of this convoluted electoral college process, it's entirely possible for the president of the United States to lose the popular vote and still be elected by a minority vote.
Well, you've cracked the code, Bob. You're right. A candidate who collects the most votes on a nationwide basis, nevertheless, might not win the electoral vote.
So how often has it happened in the history of the United States that the winner of the presidential election ended up as the loser?
It's happened 5 times, as you can see, spanning the country's history, really, including in 2 of the last 5 elections. And we can look to 3 key states in the 2016 election to illustrate how this can happen. So there you can see, even though Clinton won millions more total votes than Trump in California, Pennsylvania, and Texas combined, Trump nevertheless was awarded 3 more electoral votes in those states than Clinton. So you can extrapolate from these 3 states to see how this could play out on the national level.
Well, that explains a lot. The Electoral College votes matter more than actual votes by American citizens.
Yeah, and I would argue, Bob, that a significant way in which the Electoral College has affected, or one might say corrupted, the US political process is manifest in the way our presidential candidates target specific swing states or battleground states, those states with substantial numbers of electoral votes, rather than trying to win over as many voters as possible nationally. So right now, almost no one thinks Trump will win the national popular vote next month, but it really doesn't matter, as you've now seen. He can win by once again assembling the right combination of individual state wins to get to his 270 electoral votes.
Well, really, now, how likely do you think it is that Trump could do that?
Take a look at this analysis from Nate Silver, who runs the 538 analytics project. According to his analysis, Biden could win the popular vote by 2 to 3 percentage points, and that would amount to between 3 and 4.5 million popular votes, and still have a less than 50% chance of becoming president. Even if Biden wins the popular vote by 4 to 5%, that's up to 7.5 million votes, you can see Trump would still have a 1 in 10 chance of winning. Now, to complicate things further, Bob, it's also possible that neither candidate receives a majority of electoral votes. And in that case, the election leaves the Electoral College process we've been describing and moves to Congress, where the House of Representatives would vote to elect the president.
Has there ever been a situation where that has happened?
It's happened 3 times, not since the 19th century. We'll talk further about this when we look at some possible scenarios for Election Day and beyond. In the meantime, let's quickly look at the Electoral College timeline of key events. I'm just going to call out 4 for your attention. Of course, Election Day is on the 3rd, less than 2 weeks. Then between December 8th and December 23rd, the slates of electors that we talked about are certified by each state and then transmitted to Washington, D.C. On January 6th, the new Congress will meet in joint session. That's the Senate and the House of Representatives meeting together to count the electoral votes and ideally to determine the winner, leading to Inauguration Day at noon on January 20th.
You know, I find it hard to fathom why you came up with a system this complicated. Can you tell your baffled Canadian neighbors how and why this system came into existence and why it matters so much now?
Well, I would argue, Bob, that it's not only complicated, but also that it's or even anti-democratic. And I would argue further that the answer to your question, the real answer, is rooted in the very foundations of the American Republic. So we should spend a few minutes on that. You know, the American Revolution, contrary to what I was taught in my civics classes, wasn't fomented by an oppressed underclass. It was a revolt of white men of property who just didn't want to pay taxes. We could ask whether that sounds familiar right now. They sought to be free from what they perceived as the oppressive power of George III over people like them and their property. So they established a new nation grounded in what I think we now might characterize as a sort of radical libertarianism. They also were a minority, and they feared the unwashed masses who would embrace their cause. So they created minoritarian institutions as a hedge against the majority, as a hedge really, in my view, against democracy. So what did they do? First, they limited voting rights to white men who owned property. And those men constituted only about 6% of the new country's population. By comparison, and we'll come back to this, slaves constituted about 20% of the population. They created a nominally representational House of Representatives, of course, representative of that 6% only, but to constrain its power, they established a Senate in which each state had the same number of votes irrespective of its population. And they gave that chamber an effective veto power over the House. And for good measure, they created the Electoral College. Now, this was the context in which the Electoral College was devised. It reflected the founders' apprehension about participatory democracy and the centrality of wealth and racism in American society, culture, and politics, and also the fundamental importance of a slave economy to this new country. As we'll see, this legacy continues to inform the present moment.
What you have just said is almost unimaginable, Mace. Can you please repeat what you just said?
This was the context, Bob, in which the Electoral College was devised. It reflected the founders' apprehension about participatory democracy, the fundamental importance of a slave economy to the fledgling country, and the centrality of wealth and racism in American society, culture, and politics. And this legacy continues to inform the present moment.
anyone tried to dismantle this unjust system?
Oh, sure they have. Interestingly, historically, a majority of Americans have favored a direct national vote for president. Between 1800 and 2016, more than 800 constitutional amendments were introduced to fix or abolish the college. One of the more recent ones was in 1961, for example, when Estes Kefauver, a reformist Democratic senator and one-time presidential candidate, denounced the Electoral College as what he called a loaded pistol pointed at our system of government. He understood that the Electoral College is a legacy of distrust of the people, as we've discussed, and that at some point its anti-democratic distortions could threaten the government's integrity. Here's one of the things I think he was getting at. And you can see here that electoral votes don't scale evenly. States receive at least 3, regardless of their population, and the electoral votes of the most populous states, towards the left of the graph, are functionally capped by the number of US House members. So voters in less populated states are overrepresented in the Electoral College relative to those in large states. This is a structural inequality that also dilutes the vote of racial minorities because they live disproportionately in more populous states. So this year, for example, predominantly white Wyoming will cast 3 electoral votes, or about 1 per every 200,000 people. Highly diverse California will cast 55 votes, which corresponds to only 1 per 700,000 people. But in light of the founders' concerns, Bob, I guess one could argue that a system designed to favor voters in small and rural states over voters in large and urban ones, and to favor southern states over northern ones, and to favor whites over racial minorities is actually working exactly as intended.
So are you saying that fatal flaw sewing into the very fabric of the US Constitution, the one that is now threatening to bring down the US in the same way that constitutional weaknesses brought down the Soviet Union, is linked to slavery and institutionalized white supremacy?
I am saying that, and I guess we ought then to spend a few minutes on what we can call the Southern strategy. Before the Civil War, the Electoral College assured that slavery shaped presidential elections because of the notorious 3/5 compromise. This is enshrined in the Constitution, and it was needed to secure its ratification by slave states. It's a grotesque provision, really. It decreed that Black slaves, although they were not deemed to be persons and had no rights, were nevertheless counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of allocating seats in the House of Representatives and votes in the Electoral College. Well, what did this do? It increased the electoral power of slave states and gave white Southerners disproportionate influence that could and did affect the outcome of elections. What's less known is that white governments that came to power in the Southern states after the Civil War were the political beneficiaries of what now amounted to what I would call a 5/5 clause. And that's because former slaves, after emancipation, counted fully toward congressional representation and electoral votes, but continued to be disenfranchised, no longer by the Constitution, but by individual states' Jim Crow laws. So for this and other reasons, and it's a much longer conversation, one could say that the South won the war.
Oh, did you just suggest that the Southern states used the Electoral College to block expanded civil and political rights of Blacks, and that by way of ensuring that the Electoral College has not been abolished, that the South has in effect won and continues to win the Civil War?
That is exactly what I'm saying. And in fact, by the 1940s, Southern leaders came to understand that their disproportional weight in presidential elections was a critical bulwark against Northern pressure to enlarge the civil and political rights of Black Americans. In our day, and in the context of the upcoming election, voter suppression is the Jim Crow of politics and is practiced nationwide by the Republican Party. Under the pretext of preventing voter fraud, which, by the way, is virtually non-existent, Republicans continue to try to suppress voting in certain demographics in order to game the Electoral College and preserve minority rule.
So do you think that this is a threat to democracy in America? And if so, why do you think that?
I'm concerned that for Trump to win again without winning the most votes would shatter whatever faith millions of Americans might still have in their political system. And after such an outcome, Bob, I guess I'd have to turn the question back to you. How could you continue to say that the United States is a democracy? Indeed, in less than 2 weeks, the United States could put on a show of democratic dysfunction that would make it look like a banana republic.
Whose feet do you think the American people should lay the blame for this deep, ongoing, and dangerous injustice?
Well, there's the history we just reviewed. And in our time, certainly both major parties have contributed to the country's systemic dysfunction. But I would submit, Bob, that it's that American democracy fundamentally is in danger because the modern Republican Party is determined to stay in power, not by getting the most votes, but through other means. And that brings us to this moment and to presidential succession. It's interesting to note that the Constitution doesn't provide for the peaceful transition of power. I think we could say it presupposes it. And historically, that presupposition has been accurate. Even when election results have been unclear or contested, US political leaders have done the right thing. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton conceded, even though she'd won the popular tally by more than 2 million votes. And in 2000, Al Gore won the popular tally by about 500,000 votes, but chose not to pursue constitutional and legal remedies that remained available for him and that very likely would have sent him to the White House. I think Gore saw it as his duty to avoid precipitating a national crisis in the spirit of respect for the Constitution and comity and good faith. And I think we have to ask whether those qualities will guide Donald Trump next month.
Well, given the qualities that Trump has exhibited over the past 4 years, what do you anticipate will happen in November?
Well, I'm not going to handicap outcomes, but I think we should be prepared for the worst. But I would also submit that the general press and the punditocracy are missing the ball. They think the worst is that Trump might refuse to vacate the White House if he loses. Look, I think that's unlikely. And even if it does happen, it wouldn't alter the succession process. The Constitution specifies that the term of the president ends at noon on January 20th. So if the Electoral College certifies Joe Biden the winner, then at noon on January 20th, Trump automatically will cease to be president and lose any constitutional authority, even if he were to barricade himself inside the Oval Office.
So if that's not the worst case, then what do you think is the worst case?
I think the worst case is that Trump uses his power, as actually he began to do the very day he took office in 2017, to muddy the waters and prevent a dispositive outcome against him. I think if Trump and the Republican Party played it tight, they'll try to obstruct a legally unambiguous victory for Biden, both in the Electoral College and in Congress if it comes to that. And make no mistake, Trump's legal teams already are engaging in litigation to suppress voting before the election, and they're laying the groundwork for post-election efforts to overturn or circumvent the results of the vote count in battleground states, and possibly with the effect of extending the dispute all the way to Inauguration Day.
So extending the dispute all the way to Inauguration Day, if he does that, what would that look like?
Consider a scenario. It's late on November 3rd, Election Day. Hundreds of thousands of votes in key states still have to be counted due to the increased use of voting by mail because of the pandemic. The media haven't yet called the race, but based on votes that have been tallied, Trump appears to lead in enough states to reach at least 270 electoral votes at that moment in time. What does he do? Well, of course, he declares victory. But because many more Democrats than Republicans voted by mail, Biden eventually pulls ahead as those votes are counted. That's a phenomenon that's now being called the blue shift. That's just one of many scenarios the Transition Integrity Project, a nonpartisan group of about 100 experts, explored this summer while researching how possible election crises could unfold.
So what does that mean in terms of transition that might be different from the past?
Let's take that generic example and make it more concrete. So let's say Trump leads in the state of Pennsylvania on the night of November 3rd, but as mail ballots are counted, Biden starts to pull ahead. Pennsylvania's Democratic governor certifies Biden's victory and transmits the state's designated Democratic electors as Pennsylvania's official slate for the Electoral College. But meanwhile, the Republican-controlled Pennsylvania state legislature alleges that all the mail-in votes for Biden are fraudulent, and it certifies a Trump victory and transmits a slate of Republican electors to Washington.
Okay, that sounds to me like this is where the Supreme Court would have to intervene.
Well, possibly, but here's an interesting wrinkle. Even if the courts rule against the validity of one set of electors or another, Congress still has the power to consider any slates of electors as long as they already have been certified and transmitted to Washington, D.C. That's precisely where our hypothetical lands. Two slates of dueling electors will have been certified by the state of Pennsylvania.
So how serious a concern is this?
It's not an idle one. Of the key swing states, and depending on how you count, there are between 9 and 11, 8 have Republican legislatures. So even if Biden wins a particular state and his electors are certified, one or more of those legislatures could send what they would contend is the legitimate slate of Republican electors to Washington. Now, if on November 3rd, the Democrats take the House and take the Senate, as they might, both chambers presumably would vote to accept the Democratic Electoral College slates during their joint session on January 6th. Conversely, if the Republicans hold the Senate and recapture the House, which appears unlikely, then the Republican slates presumably would be accepted.
This is very complicated. It seems that you've set up a house of cards simply to perpetuate the existence and the unjust judgments of the Electoral College. How many Americans even understand how all this works?
I think not nearly as many as should. But I want to return to our Pennsylvania example and make it even more complicated. So again, let's assume November 3rd, the pre-election status quo prevails in Congress. So Republicans hold the Senate, Democrats hold the House. And then suppose that in their joint session on January 6th, the Democratic Senate and the Republican Senate and Democratic House can't reach agreement on the electoral vote tally. Each purports to award Pennsylvania's electoral votes to the candidate of its majority party. And let's say further that as a result, neither candidate is deemed to have secured 270 electoral votes. At that point, absent a compromise, the election for president would be held in the House of Representatives. And there, each state delegation would get one vote. The victor must win a majority, that's 26 votes. More complications, Bob. Currently, Republicans have the delegation majority in 26 states in the House, and Democrats have 22. 2 states are tied. But because the vote will be held by the new Congress that'll be sworn in after the November 3rd election, we just can't say today what the balance of power in the House will be. What we can say is that not for nothing are the Democrats laser focused on flipping enough House seats in key states to secure a majority of 26 state delegations, or at least to deny the Republicans a majority.
So what happens if this is not resolved by Inauguration Day?
One more complication. If by January 20, neither candidate has won a majority either in the Electoral College or in a House of Representatives vote, then the Speaker of the House becomes acting president. So to game this out a little bit more, it's possible that Speaker Nancy Pelosi could resign her House seat on January 20 in order to serve as president. So think about it. Americans no longer seem to inhabit a shared reality. and different Americans could have different presidents. In one scenario, Chief Justice John Roberts swears in Nancy Pelosi, while simultaneously Justice Clarence Thomas swears in Donald Trump. Or no one is sworn in, but Biden and Trump or Pelosi all claim, or each claims, the power of the presidency. So at the end of that process, I think we'd have to ask, would either side stand down for the good of the country? And if they didn't, would things spiral out of control with the possibility of civil unrest and violence?
The plot that was recently discovered to kidnap the governor of Michigan was deeply troubling. Do you think that there is a potential for this to turn into a civil war?
Well, that's a strong term. I do think many Americans are taking controversy and turbulence for granted. And I guess we shouldn't forget that there are many more guns than people in the United States, and that many of those guns are concentrated in the hands of Mr. Trump's most fervent and distrustful and impressionable supporters.
Again, how real do you think the risk of permanent damage to democracy is in America right now at this moment?
Well, I think the risk of damage is quite real. And I think it's real because the modern Republican Party has traded democracy for the desire to stay in power, in effect, to consolidate a permanent minoritarian state. And I think that you, Bob, as a Canadian, and other Canadians would agree with me when I say that competing political parties are vital to a democracy. Opposition parties keep governments accountable. Opposition parties promote stability. Opposition parties help to constrain corruption. I think the Republican Party understands this, and that's why for decades now they've been taking steps to attain and preserve power without having to win a majority of voters. And we can just provide a few examples quickly. In Texas, for example, acceptable identification to vote for president on November 3rd is a gun license, but not a student ID from a state university. Georgia law invalidates voter registrations with any spelling errors. Florida recently imposed what amounts to a poll tax on more than 1 million former felons. Republican officials and local party organizations in numerous states have purged voter rolls, closed polling places, required that mail-in ballot signatures be notarized, and even installed a counterfeit ballot drop-off boxes in traditionally Democratic precincts. In fact, Bob, just today we're following reports that voters wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts were turned away from polls in Memphis, and that Democratic registered voters in Pennsylvania, Florida, and I believe Arizona received emails overnight from Proud Boys, the neo-Nazi group, telling them that they must change their registrations to Republican and vote for Trump, or the Proud Boys would come after them.
This is simply mind-boggling, Mace, just mind-boggling.
It is, and it's all designed to suppress voting by constituencies that consistently vote Democratic. And wait, because there's still more. Because even if Biden wins overwhelmingly and the Republicans' challenges are unsuccessful, I think Trump could continue to sow discord. First, even now the administration is redoubling its efforts, some of them legally dubious at best, to repeal or rescind decades of regulations related to environmental protection and workplace safety, food security, employee and consumer rights, and privacy. And then between November 4th and January 20th, Trump could refuse to take Biden's calls. He could instruct his cabinet and administration officials not to meet with the Biden transition team. He could tell them to withhold or destroy their files. And according to the Transition Integrity Project, Trump may declassify sensitive documents or use pardons to thwart criminal prosecutions, including of himself, to bribe and silence associates, to divert federal funds to his businesses, or arrange business deals with foreign governments that benefit him and his family financially. So what I'm getting at, Bob, is that Trump's final act of sabotage against the American people could be to derail the orderly transition of power that has helped to define the entire American experiment. And this, by the way, during a pandemic and a recession, and at a time of deep distrust of government.
Could this be the end of Donald Trump?
Well, again, I'm not making predictions, but I would say that if it is, I think it would be a fitting conclusion to his presidency, which I think history will record as a long march of continuous and wanton and tragic destruction. You know, the United States' status as the world's leading democracy has been built historically on its commitment fundamentally to democratic values, on its standing in the world and its loyalty to its allies, on its faith in reason and science, on its aspiration, at least, to equality and diversity. And I would submit that Mr. Trump stormed that deeply flawed, to be sure, but still magnificent edifice and burned it to the ground. So even if he's gone, his legacy will live on in the damage he's done to the planet, to human rights, to America's leadership. It's a long list. And I also fear it'll take years or more to repair the damage domestically and internationally. And that's time that I think I'd agree the world just doesn't have.
So this is certainly a transformational moment for the United States and for the world.
It certainly is.
You've painted a dark and troubling picture, Mace. Where's the hope in this?
I try, Bob, to remember Martin Luther King's admonition. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's inscribed on his memorial in Washington, D.C. I also remember that 50 years later, former Attorney General Eric Holder reminded us again that the arc only bends towards justice because people pull it towards justice. It just doesn't happen on its own. So to answer your question, I think hope resides in the fact that most Americans are out in front of their leaders on the challenges confronting us today, and that they're pulling in the right direction. And polls consistently reflect this on climate action, on racism, on structural economic inequality, on LGBTQ rights, on universal health care, even on abortion and capital punishment. Also, note that the US will be a majority-minority country by 2045. And rather than fearing this, I think most Americans embrace that future. They embrace a future enriched by a diversity of colors and backgrounds and beliefs. Bob Dylan said, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." I think Republicans know, and that's why they're fighting a rearguard action to preserve their minority power by trying to persuade Americans that we can go back to the future, that somehow they can restore us to a mythical, trouble-free past. Happily, I don't think most Americans buy that. I think they're looking to a different kind of future, and they'll continue to work to achieve it, however fitfully and alternately that progress is.
Thank you so very much for talking to us, Mace.
You're very welcome, Bob. Thank you.
Wow, that was sobering. That was insightful. That was amazing. And I think, you know, it comes back to the quote I've read that governments are a reflection of the collective consciousness. And so let's hope that we really see people, as you said, Mace, there's a real opportunity for us to come together on this, because we've been living obviously in an illusion. So thank you so much. Now, I haven't seen any questions come into the Q&A box, which makes me think that everybody's jaws are on the floor and people are just trying to absorb this program. It's just phenomenal. So Jon, I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions for Mace?
I don't have some questions. I have some observations for Mace, and also on it's a very frightening prospect, because the difference between Biden and Trump administration in terms of climate and biodiversity crisis management is very stark. So let me show this by two numbers. Under a Trump presidency, the carbon emissions in the US are predicted to increase by 1.8 billion metric tons by 2035. That's a 35% increase over the 2019 emissions in the US. On the other hand, under a Biden presidency, carbon emissions by 2050 could be net neutral. In other words, the amount of carbon created in the economy would be offset by capture and storage by natural and engineering terms. So what a difference in the climate policies. So let me explain why this is happening in terms of the UN process, the regulatory process that Mace talked about with the Trump administration, and some of the creative solutions that we're looking at. Under the UN conference will be held in November 2021, which will review the Paris agreements of 2015. And so we all know that the Trump administration has demolished the targets created by the Obama administration in 2015. But the interesting thing is that the US dominance in global politics and multinational institutions is waning because of the Trump administration. So that even though Trump has demolished the carbon emission standards for the US, other nations are stepping up to the mark. So Canada, the European Union, the UK are all claiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. Even China has recently announced it will become carbon neutral by 2060. And under a Biden administration, US would be well on course to be a carbon neutral country by 2050. So it's clear that the large emission countries are proceeding to increase the carbon or decrease their carbon footprints over the next 30 years compared to the US. Now, there are a number of reasons why this kind of scenario may actually play out. One of them is that the price of renewable energy is dropping quickly and is well below now the costs of fiber fuels replacement. Secondly, large institutional investment portfolios are shifting towards renewables away from fossil fuels, so follow the money. Thirdly, the pandemic is structurally changing people's travel and transportation habits and affecting the amount of fossil fuels that we use in these areas. And finally, most jurisdictions are continuously improving their building codes so that energy efficiency is becoming paramount over the next decade or so. But why would Trump's administration, if it was elected in the next couple of weeks, create 1 billion metric tons of new carbon emissions? Well, because as Mace says, he is systematically dismantling the regulatory framework for both carbon and biodiversity in the States. So in carbon, he is removing the controls on power plants. He has reduced the car fuel standards required for amount of petrol people use in their cars. He is eliminating wetlands. He is increasing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. And he's opening up wildlands for exploration and impacting wildlife protection. So if there was a 1.8 billion increase in 2035, that's equivalent to the current emissions from the combination of Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And remember, by 2035, these three countries have pledged to reduce their carbon emissions by 40%. Now, under the Biden presidency, the US would rejoin the UN Climate Accord, and he would invest $2 trillion in green infrastructure for electric cars and grids, public transit, renewable electric power, energy retrofits, agriculture conservation and changes of industrial agriculture, and the restoration of wetlands or wildlands. Further, there is a real chance of a Democratic Senate and House, and that would affect the budgeting process and how laws are passed. So there could be a real alignment between a Biden presidency and the Congress, which make for these changes to be much more effective. The International Energy Agency is forecasting potentially sustainable development scenarios based on the trends of a Biden presidency. So they're saying that by 2030, CO2 reduction from fossil fuels could be reduced by 45%, coal reduction by 60%. Renewable energy could increase from 27 to 60%. Technology advancement in nuclear power and hydrogen could move us towards carbon neutrality, and we can increase carbon storage both by regenerating natural systems and engineering carbon capture and storage. We all go through disruption, denial, and transformation. I think the world is beginning to show that we're shifting through disruption and denial and moving towards transformation. And even Alberta, this is for Bob and Mace, are beginning to transition to geothermal energy, extracting hydrogen from oil and gas sands, and looking at carbon storage. There is a distinct difference now between economic growth and carbon emissions. But I want to close this commentary on ways in which individuals and communities can make a difference. We don't have to rely on leadership at the national level. We can do it ourselves. So let's take an example of Esquimalt, which is a community within the Greater Victoria area. And they've committed themselves to become zero waste producers by the 2025. Now, this is a big deal because right now, Esquimalt produces about 35% of its waste. It goes to the landfill, local landfill here called the Heartland dump. The rest of the waste is a mixed bag, but under a gasifier, which is a way of converting waste into energy, all but only 3% of the waste would go to the landfill, 9% would be recycled, and the rest would be thermally converted into a gas which can be used for heating and other purposes. But the big deal here is that the Heartland landfill is due to an expansion because of the current waste load. And if it expands, it will remove 28 hectares of forested land, which are within its footprint. But this is a total contradiction to the CRD, the Capital Regional District's policy of increasing forests and trees to help store carbon. So here we have one community, Esquimalt, finding a solution that would eliminate waste going to the Heartland landfill and also eliminate the need to remove that forest canopy. And yet the other municipalities, 13 of them, have yet to think about this and are still pursuing the need to dump waste in landfill and create these problems. So we have to support, and I believe that in a recent public review that was undertaken by Esquimalt, 85% of the population supported the gasifier and a shift towards zero waste. So communities can make a difference, but so can individuals. I want to talk about some work done by a colleague of mine at Aquatech Scientific in creating and maintaining urban creeks in natural conditions. I've got a few slides to show two projects that they're working on. One is Dockside Green, a mixed-use development in Victoria's Inner Harbour. Its sewage is treated to an advanced level at a treatment plant on site. So all of the sewage from the development is treated, and then it's put into a constructed creek together with rainwater. So this creek is an artificial creek that is uses the treated sewage and rainwater as its water source. And the interesting thing is, as you can see here, it's become a natural feature in the dockside development, and the suites that border the the creek are now the most valuable. Excess increased value is paying for the construction and the maintenance of this creek. And not only that, but next door to the property is a market garden, which is fed by some of the treated sewage and by the rainwater, and the crops are used for the local residents and to support local farmers markets. And another one is the Esquimalt Lagoon, which is in southwest of Vancouver, Victoria, where a local creek has been reconstructed into a fish spawning channel. All the groundwater and rainwater from the hard surfaces around the development is placed into a reconstructed creek and also used for salmon spawning. And the natural vegetation on the area is being replanted to attract shorebirds. And one of the sites there is being converted into a restaurant to act as a viewing platform so that people can see the increase of shoreline activity. And finally, the area is being granted some boardwalks to allow for education for residents and for students, and are surrounding the boardwalks with all this luscious green vegetation, which is capturing carbon and increasing storage. So it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and adding to carbon storage. So climate change affects floods and droughts. These functioning creeks and watersheds will become more and more important.
Thank you, John. That's just, that's inspiring. We always like to provide solutions. Now, a whole bunch of questions have come in, so I would like to address some of those. We've got one from Colin Campbell. It says, what would it take for any government in the US to tackle the governance failures in their ancient and out-of-date constitutional framework? What options exist?
That's a really good question. First, I mentioned there had been 800 attempts to try to reform or eliminate the Electoral College. It is embedded in the Constitution, so that in order to make a change fundamentally in the Electoral College would require a constitutional amendment, and that is an almost insurmountable process. It would require a 2/3 approval vote in both the Senate and the House, and then approval by 3/4 of the states. And it's a protracted process and has never succeeded with respect to the Electoral College. However, having said that, and this is a really interesting question, I mentioned that although the Constitution creates the Electoral College, it leaves to the states complete latitude as to how they determine how their electors are designated and for whom those electors can vote. And there's an initiative underway now in the states that is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And political leaders in many states have realized that they could accomplish essentially contractually a workaround to the constitutional amendment requirement. And what they are trying to reach agreement on is that the states who join this compact would award all of their electoral votes, not to the candidate who wins the popular vote in their states, but to the candidate who wins the national popular vote. So it effectively circumvents the Electoral College. I think so far 15 or 17 states have signed on. I don't know that it would be, that it could be effectuated without a critical mass of states, and I don't think that they think they've reached it yet. That would be one way, really sort of a backdoor way to remedy the sort of the injustices caused by the Electoral College.
Thank you, Mace. This one's from Anne. She asks, are there Republicans, do you think, who will speak up for democracy and decency?
Would that there were. I think, that, look, my view is that the Republicans don't like Donald Trump, but he is a good vessel for them. And I think Trump has really, because of his populist appeal, he has managed to help the Republicans realize many of their decades-long ambitions, including stacking the Supreme Court, which will really become a fait accompli within days. So they've been silent over the last 4 years. If you're following the news in the States, you may see that over the last few days, a small handful of Republicans have started to stand up, although none of them publicly, to Trump. And the message seems to be, oh, I never really liked him. I never supported him. But I didn't want to get in trouble, and I wanted to do the best I could for my constituents, so I kept my mouth shut. But they're distancing themselves now because I think there is significant concern that they're going to lose the Senate.
And then there's another one. Are there precautions that Canada should take to guard against the chaos that could follow the US election?
Well, I think that's one for Bob and John and you. And I know it's, from my conversations with Canadians, it's a subject of considerable concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I guess someone asked, what accounts for the fracturing of consensus among political elites about these crucial conventions?
Well, I think my observation is that in the States, as in Canada, I think Canada lags the States by a generation or so, but the political conversation has become increasingly polarized and binary. And shades of gray are no longer tolerated. And in the States, at least, it's become personalized. I don't see that quite so much here, but in the States, if you disagree with me, then I hate you. If you disagree with me, we can't have a relationship. And that's been, that sort of characterizes our national politics now.
Right. And Tom has said, Trump has joked about leaving the country if he loses. Has any president done that?
I'm not aware of any president going to Elba or anything in some sort of permanent self-imposed exile, perhaps on vacation. I do think it has some interesting national security implications, though. He has business dealings with China and Russia, which are not fully understood, and it's believed by some, and there may be some basis for it, that they have certain levers they can push with him. I don't know, maybe he could go live with Edward Snowden in Moscow.
Jeez, yeah. Hey, there's tons of great comments here from everyone. Thank you. And we'll post those with the video and any questions that we didn't get answered today. But Jon, I want to turn it back to you and thank you very much, Mace. Thank you, Bob Sandford. And Jon, would you like to share the exciting and timely program we also have planned for next week and let people know that Mace will be coming back after the election?
Yes, I will. Next week, we have a call for a new forest framework with Kathleen Code, who is the vice chair for the Wildwood Sustainable Forest up in Nanaimo. She's going to be renewing her call for a new forest framework in British Columbia based on ecosystem principles. The provincial government recently released its old growth strategy, which fell well short of meeting the principles for a new forest framework. So Kathleen will demonstrate how these new values are required to support sustainable forests by mid-century, provide a wider range of employment, carbon storage, protecting biodiversity, contributing to reconciliation, and providing spiritual and emotional support for the communities. This is part of an election. We had an election in British Columbia, and it's important that people vote for the election on Saturday, and they represent these values that we need to support a new forest framework in British Columbia. And in 2 weeks' time, we will return with Bob and Mace for a post-US election review of what has actually happened in the election and what some of the issues that Mace so clearly raised, how they're being played out as we see them on the 4th. And we'll be joined by Tom Axworthy, one of the senior policy advisors to the federal government, on the implication of the US election on Canadian interests. So 2 wonderful webinars for the next 2 weeks.
I'm really excited about it. I hope everyone will join us again. Thank you so much for being so engaged as an audience. Thanks, Mace. Thanks, Bob. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.